Movie Reviews. Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood is directed by Marielle Heller, and it is the biopic drama about Mr. Rogers. So I'm just going to say up front, the better title to this is Won't You Be My Neighbor? And it's too bad that was already taken. The plot on IMDb reads, based on the true story of a real-life friendship between Fred Rogers and journalist Tom Janad. So while this movie is based on a true story of an article that was written about Mr. Rogers, I believe in the late 90s, the name of the journalist is changed from that name to Lloyd Vogel. Let me just start there. This is not a Mr. Rogers movie. It is in the sense where the whole plot revolves around him, but really, this is a story about this journalist, Lloyd Vogel. The arc that this movie follows is around his character, and Mr. Rogers is really just the side story that helps this character get from point A to point B. So by the time Oscar season comes and we see Tom Hanks nominated for Best Actor, that's incorrect because he is a supporting actor in this movie. Now, sure, maybe it's just semantics at this point, but I really do think that matters while going into this movie to know that up front. This movie is advertised as a biopic about Mr. Rogers, and in a sense it is, and it does tell his story through the eyes of this journalist, but if anything else, this movie is less interested in telling that story and more interested in telling the story of this journalist and how Mr. Rogers has ultimately changed his life. So if you want to get on board with this movie, you got to get on board with that idea, which is fine. I actually think it's a really creative way to tell a biopic, and it's a lot more creative than some other formulas that we've seen in previous years. But again, this is not a Mr. Rogers movie. It is a Lloyd Vogel movie, and you have to buy into that character if you're going to like this movie. And so did I? Kind of. I would say this movie is fine. And if we're using a large scale from bad to great, I'd say it's on the upper edge of fine. Pretty much it's a good movie. My hesitation to calling this a great movie is all around that fact that this isn't centrally about Mr. Rogers, and what this movie is about I don't find as interesting as the character of Mr. Rogers. The story that it does tell about this journalist who has very obvious issues concerning forgiveness, family, all these things, it's too on the nose and it's pushed in front of you, making it very obvious, like, here's this character, here's his issues, let's see how he gets through them today. And when I think back on this movie, these issues and the way that they're resolved are so cookie cutter, it feels like you're watching a children's television show, which I think was their intention in doing that. This movie opens up with Mr. Rogers explaining what's going to happen in this movie, like, this is my friend Lloyd, we're going to see how he overcomes his issues. And so yeah, for the sake of being creative and making it feel like you're watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, then yes, they did a great job. However, I'm not as interested in watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I want to see a movie about Mr. Rogers. I think just giving this story a little bit more nuance and making the point of it a little less obvious and in your face would have helped this movie a lot. That being said, outside of the very cookie cutter stereotypical storyline that you already know the ending before you even see the movie, where this movie does wonders in is in Tom Hanks' performance as Mr. Rogers. Now, it does take a couple minutes for you to kind of wrap your mind around the fact that, okay, this is Tom Hanks playing Mr. Rogers, and he does appear like that for the first couple minutes, but once you get over that, you get so used to it, and it feels like you're just watching Mr. Rogers talk to you. There are several moments in this movie where he even breaks the fourth wall, and he's just staring at you, and you can feel this intense emotion coming over you. Fantastic performance. Again, he should not be nominated for Best Actor. If anything, Best Supporting Actor, and I don't know if it's the strongest performance of the year, but it's very solid and one of his top 5 of his careers at least. While I will say that's the strongest part about the movie, it's also kind of a crutch to the movie. Because basically, if you throw Mr. Rogers in anything, it's going to be a great movie and people are going to love it. He's the type of person that no one has a negative thing to say about. That's why this documentary that came out last year was so fantastic, because he was such a great person that everyone could rally around. You couldn't help but love what you were watching, and this movie does the same thing. However, if you were to take him out of this movie and tell this movie just about any person, it's not going to be powerful at all. So it's just a hard balance all around, because on one hand you got an okay movie, but you throw Mr. Rogers in and it makes it great, but at the same time the movie kind of latches onto that too hard and pulls these nostalgic strings that everyone has because everyone has grown up with Mr. Rogers. So that's why I say it's a pretty good, fine movie. It's competent. it does what it needs to do, and it's a great movie to see with your whole family for the holiday season, just in time. It's definitely Oscar bait and gonna be nominated for quite a few things, and so can you complain? No, because it's definitely not the worst Oscar bait movie we've seen. I will also say, from a creative aspect, there's a lot of cool things that this movie does do. It adds elements from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, such as the puppets and the little miniature town, and you see a lot of scenes transition with that town coming from New York to Pittsburgh, and the models are just incredible to look at. So it's a fun movie visually, and from a film standpoint, it's really well put together. So I would recommend this movie. It's not one you definitely need to see in theaters right away, but if you want to get ahead of Oscar conversation, this is the first place to start. Ultimately, I'm going to give this movie a 70 out of 100. Very enjoyable. If you follow me on Letterboxd, again, why don't you by now? I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. That's a good score. If you like this video and want to see more content like it, go ahead, hit like and subscribe. Comment below what did you think of this movie, and I will see you next time.